My name is Clara, and I'm 29 years old. I inherited a $25.6 million company from my grandfather, but when I got married, I kept it a secret even from my fiancé James. I wanted our love to be real, not tied to money. Thank God I did. The day after our wedding, my mother-in-law showed up with a notary demanding I sign it all over. That moment broke something in me, but it also saved me. Have you ever had to hide something to protect yourself? I'm curious where you're watching from. If this story resonates, please like and subscribe to join me on this journey. I grew up in a small Ohio town where the summers smelled of cut grass and the winters bit your fingers raw. My mom Patricia raised me alone after my dad walked out when I was 6. She worked double shifts at the diner, her hands always chapped from dishwater, but she'd still braid my hair before school humming old country tunes. We didn't have much, but we had my grandfather Harold, who lived in a creaky house just down the road. His logistics company was his pride, built from a single truck to a fleet that moved goods across the Midwest. He'd sit me on his knee showing me maps of delivery routes, his eyes bright with stories of grit and deals made on handshakes. When I was 10, he gave me a tiny model truck saying, "Clara, one day you'll steer something big. Guard it with your heart." Harold passed when I was 22, just after I graduated college with a business degree I'd clawed my way through on scholarships. His death hit like a freight train. I was at his bedside holding his rough hand when he whispered, "You're ready, kid." Days later, his lawyer handed me a letter and the keys to his company, now worth $25.6 million. The letter was short but heavy. "Clara, this is yours. But wealth draws wolves. Test love before you share it." I tucked those words into my soul along with the grief of losing him. Running the company was daunting, but I learned fast, keeping it steady while living quietly, blending into my old life. 2 years later, I met James at an art fair in Columbus. I was browsing watercolor sketches, feeling out of place in my faded jeans, when he bumped into me, spilling his coffee. He laughed all easy charm and offered to buy me a new shirt. Instead, we ended up at a food truck talking over greasy tacos about our favorite books and the way rain makes everything feel new. James was a graphic designer with a lopsided smile and dreams of starting his own studio. Our first date was at a hole-in-the-wall cafe where he sketched my portrait on a napkin, his fingers smudged with charcoal. I fell hard, not for grand gestures, but for how he listened, really listened, when I talked about my mom's struggles or my love for open roads. We dated for 18 months, each moment stitching us closer. He'd leave sticky notes on my fridge with silly doodles, and I'd cook him lumpy pancakes on Sundays. When he proposed under a string of fairy lights at a park, his voice shaky but sure, I said yes without a second thought. But Harold's letter haunted me. I hadn't told James about the company. I'd said I was a freelance consultant, which wasn't entirely a lie, just a shield. The money was in trusts, the company run by a small team I oversaw discreetly. I wanted James to love me for me, not for a fortune I hadn't earned. Still, as I slipped on my engagement ring, guilt prickled. Was I betraying him by keeping this secret? One night, sorting through Harold's old things in my attic, I found his journal, leather-bound and worn. Pages were filled with stories of partners who'd turned on him, friends who'd eyed his success with greed. One entry stopped me cold. "Trust is a gamble. Bet small until you're sure." My stomach twisted. James was good, wasn't he? But my mom's voice echoed too. She'd met James a few times and liked him, but there was always a pause in her smile, a quiet, "He seems almost too perfect, Clara." I brushed it off, blaming her caution on her own scars from my dad. Yet as I closed the journal, I made a choice. I wouldn't tell James about the company, not yet. I needed to be sure not just of him, but of us. The wedding was coming, and I told myself I'd find the right moment after, when love felt solid enough to carry the truth. Wedding planning was a whirlwind, but I wanted it simple. A backyard ceremony, wildflowers on folding tables, and a playlist James and I made together. I told him I'd saved up from consulting gigs to cover it, which wasn't entirely untrue, just easier than explaining the truth. My company's profits were locked away, and I lived off a modest salary to keep up appearances. But James's mom, Diane, had other ideas. She swept in like a storm, all smiles and sharp edges, insisting we needed a venue with chandeliers and a 5-tier cake. "You only get married once, Clara," she said, her voice syrupy, but her eyes calculating. I brushed it off, chalking it up to her being overexcited, but her suggestions felt like demands, each one pushing for more extravagance I didn't want. Diane's questions started small but grew pointed. Over coffee one afternoon, she leaned across the table, her gold bracelets clinking. "So, Clara, what exactly do you do as a consultant? Must be lucrative to afford all this." Her tone was light, but it pinned me. I mumbled something about project management, my palms sweaty. She nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Later at a dress fitting, she asked about my family, lingering on my grandfather's little business. My stomach nodded. I'd mentioned Harold's company once to James years ago, but only in passing, saying it was sold off. Had he told her, I changed the subject, but her curiosity felt like a hook digging in. My best friend Allison saw through Diane from the start. We met for tacos one night, and she leaned in, her voice low. "Clara, that woman's got an agenda. She's way too invested in your wallet." Allison had known me since high school, back when we'd sneak into the diner to steal fries from my mom's shifts. She was blunt, fiercely loyal, and rarely wrong about people. I laughed it off, saying Diane was just a proud mom, but Allison's words stuck. She'd met Diane at an engagement party and caught her grilling James's cousin Nathan about my finances. Nathan had shrugged, but the exchange left Allison uneasy. The closer the wedding got, the more I noticed James acting strange. One evening, as we sorted invitations at his apartment, he mentioned Diane's big plans for us. "Mom thinks we should buy a house soon, maybe start a business together," he said, casual, like it was nothing. I froze, my pen hovering over an envelope. A house, a business. We'd never talked about that. I asked what he meant, and he backpedaled, saying it was just her dreaming out loud. But his words felt like pebbles in my shoes, small but impossible to ignore. Was Diane planting ideas in his head? Or was he in on it too? Allison's warning grew louder after a bridal shower Diane hosted. I'd wanted something low-key, but she turned it into a spectacle, renting a banquet hall and inviting half her social circle. As I opened gifts, I overheard her talking to a guest in the corner. "Clara's got a bright future," she said, her voice hushed but clear. "We're just making sure it's secure." Secure. The word hit me like a slap. I glanced at James, laughing with his aunts, oblivious. My chest tightened. Was Diane already scheming, or was I reading too much into it? By the wedding day, I was a bundle of nerves, not just from the vows, but from the weight of my secret. I stood in my dress, simple lace I'd picked myself, staring into a mirror. My mom adjusted my veil, her eyes soft but searching. "You sure about this, Clara?" she asked, not for the first time. I nodded, forcing a smile. James was my anchor, wasn't he? As I walked down the aisle, his grin lit up the yard, and for a moment I believed everything would be fine. But that night, as we danced under string lights, Diane's voice cut through the music, laughing with a guest about our family's next chapter. My heart sank. Something was coming, and I wasn't ready. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in our new apartment, sunlight spilling through cheap blinds. James was humming in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, his hair still messy from sleep. For a moment, it felt like we could be normal, just two people starting a life. I was unpacking a box of gifts, tissue paper scattered like confetti, when the doorbell rang. James opened it, and there was Diane, her purse clutched tight, a man in a stiff suit behind her. "Clara, this is Mr. Ellis, our notary," she said, her voice all business, like she was closing a deal. My stomach dropped. "A notary? Here now." Diane swept in heels, clicking on the hardwood, and set a folder on the counter. "We need to talk about your future," she said, sliding it toward me. The cover read, "Family Trust Agreement." I blinked, my hands frozen on a half-opened gift box. James looked confused, scratching his neck. "Mom, what's this about?" he asked. But Diane ignored him, her eyes locked on me. "Clara, this ensures our family's financial security. It's just paperwork, but it's important." Her smile was tight, like she'd rehearsed it. I opened the folder, my fingers clumsy. The document was dense legal jargon swimming on the page, but words like asset transfer and joint control jumped out. My heart pounded. This was about my company, the one I'd never told James about. How did she know? I glanced at Mr. Ellis, who avoided my eyes, fidgeting with his pen. Diane, I don't understand, I said, my voice thinner than I wanted. She leaned closer, her perfume sharp. It's simple, Clara. You're part of our family now. We share everything. Sign it, and we're all protected. Protected. The word felt like a blade. I looked at James, waiting for him to step in to tell her this was crazy. But he just stood there, shifting his weight, his eyes darting between us. Maybe we should hear her out, he mumbled, barely audible. My chest tightened like someone had sucked the air out of the room. Hear her out. This was my company, my grandfather's legacy, and she was trying to claw it away not even a day after I'd vowed to love her son forever. Diane's tone shifted softer now, but it dripped with guilt. Clara, refusing this would hurt James. You don't want to start your marriage like that, do you? Her words were a trap, each one tightening around me. I thought of Harold's letter, his warning about wolves. Was Diane one of them? Had she been planning this all along? My mind raced to the bridal shower, her whispered talk of securing my future. This wasn't about family. This was about control. I pushed the folder back, my hands shaking. I'm not signing anything, I said louder than I meant. Diane's face hardened, her lips a thin line. You're making a mistake, she said, standing her chair, scraping the floor. Mr. Ellis scrambled to gather his things, his face flushed. James reached for my arm, but I pulled away, my pulse hammering. Clara, come on, he said, his voice pleading, but it only made me angrier. Why wasn't he stopping her? Diane grabbed her purse, shooting me a look that could have burned through steel. We'll talk later, she said, and marched out the notary, trailing like a shadow. The door slammed and the apartment went quiet, except for the faint sizzle of forgotten pancakes. James looked at me, his eyes wide like he was seeing me for the first time. What was that about? He asked, but I couldn't answer. My throat was tight, my thoughts a jumble of betrayal and fear. Diane knew about my company, or at least enough to try this. And James? My James hadn't stood up for me. I turned away, staring at the folder still on the counter, its edges curling like a warning. I stood there, the folder on the counter like a bomb that hadn't gone off yet. James reached for me again, his voice soft, almost desperate. Clara, she didn't mean it like that. Mom's just intense about family stuff. Intense. I spun around, my eyes burning. She brought a notary to our home, James, the day after our wedding, and you just stood there. My words cracked sharp and raw. He flinched, running a hand through his hair, but he didn't answer. The silence was worse than any excuse. I grabbed my keys. Needing air, needing to think. I'm going for a drive, I said, not looking at him. He called after me, but I was already out the door, the stairwell echoing with my footsteps. In my car, I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. How did Diane know about the company I'd been so careful keeping it locked behind vague answers and a fake job title? But her questions, her prodding, they weren't random. She'd been digging, and James's hesitation made me wonder if he'd helped her. My phone buzzed. It was my mom, her voice tight when I answered. Clara, you okay? I had a bad feeling all morning. I pulled over my throat thick and told her what happened. She didn't interrupt, just listened, but when I finished, she said, You need to protect what's yours. I lost everything to a man who sweet-talked me. Don't let that happen. Her words stung not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I hung up my eyes, stinging, and drove to the one person who might have answers. Karen, a former employee who'd worked for my grandfather. Karen lived in a tidy duplex on the edge of town, her porch cluttered with potted herbs. She'd left the company years ago, but stayed in touch, always sending me Christmas cards with long handwritten notes. When I knocked, she opened the door, her gray hair pulled back, her smile fading when she saw my face. Over tea, I spilled everything: Diane's ambush, the document, James's silence. Karen's eyes narrowed. That woman's been asking about you, she said, setting her mug down hard. Called me a month ago, fishing for details about your business. Said she was planning a surprise for the wedding. My stomach twisted. A surprise. That was no surprise. It was a calculated move. Karen leaned forward, her voice low. She wanted to know how much the company was worth who ran it. I told her nothing, Clara, but she didn't stop. Kept saying it was for family investments. Investments. The word made my skin crawl. Diane wasn't just nosy. She was plotting, and she'd been at it before I even walked down the aisle. I thanked Karen, my mind racing, and drove home, the weight of her words sinking deeper with every mile. When I walked into the apartment, James was on the couch, his face drawn. "Where'd you go?" he asked, standing. I didn't answer, just dropped my keys on the table. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but cold. He nodded, sitting back down, his hands clasped like he was bracing himself. "Did you know your mom was digging into my life?" I asked. His eyes widened, but he didn't deny it fast enough. "She's in debt, isn't she?" "Karen told me she's been sniffing around my company." James looked away, his jaw tight. "She's had money problems, yeah. But she wouldn't... Clara, she's not like that. Not like that." I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised me. "She tried to make me sign over my grandfather's company, James. And you're defending her." My voice broke, and I hated it. Hated how small I sounded. He stood, stepping toward me, but I backed away. "I didn't know she'd do this," he said, his voice cracking too. "But maybe she's right. Maybe we should share everything, you know. We're married now." His words hit like a slap. Share everything? He didn't even know what everything was. And yet he was siding with her with this idea that my life's work should be theirs. I thought of my grandfather, his calloused hands, his years of sacrifice to build something lasting. And now my husband, the man I'd promised my life to, was standing here acting like it was his to take. "You don't get it," I said, my voice low, trembling. "You don't even know what you're asking for." I turned and walked to the bedroom, slamming the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break. A week after Diane's ambush, I agreed to a family dinner at her house, hoping to smooth things over. My stomach was in knots, but I told myself I could handle it, that maybe James and I could talk sense into her. The drive over was quiet, James gripping the steering wheel, his jaw tight. I stared out the window, watching suburban lawns blur by, wondering if I was walking into a trap. Diane's house was all sharp angles and too many windows, like it was trying to prove something. When we arrived, she greeted us with a hug that felt rehearsed, her perfume cloying. "Clara, so good to see you," she said, but her eyes were cold, scanning me like I was a puzzle to solve. Dinner was a spread of roasted chicken and glazed carrots, the table set with china I knew she couldn't afford. James's Aunt Sheila was there, her laugh loud and grating, along with a few cousins I barely knew. The conversation started light about the weather and wedding photos, but I felt the tension like a wire pulled taut. Halfway through the meal, Diane cleared her throat and pulled out a new folder thicker than the last one. "Clara, we need to revisit our discussion," she said, her voice calm but firm, like she was addressing a boardroom. My fork froze midair. James shifted in his seat, his eyes on his plate. She slid the folder across the table, her nails tapping the cover. "This is a marriage asset agreement," she said. "It protects everyone, especially you and James." I opened it, my hands trembling, and saw pages of fine print, but one section was highlighted, a clause transferring business holdings to a joint account under James's name. My throat closed up. This wasn't about sharing. This was about taking my company, my grandfather's legacy, and handing it over. I looked at James, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he just stared at the table, his fingers twisting his napkin. "Clara, it's for our future," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. "We're a team now. A team." My heart cracked, the sound deafening in my chest. This was the man I'd danced with under fairy lights, the man I'd trusted with my life. And now he was sitting here parroting his mother's words, asking me to give up everything I'd fought for. Sheila chimed in, her voice dripping with scorn. "Don't be selfish, Clara. Families share. You want to start your marriage on the right foot, don't you?" Her words were a jab, and the cousins nodded, their eyes on me like I was the outsider. I flipped through the document, my vision blurring, and then I saw it, a hidden clause buried in legalese that would shift controlling interest to Diane if James deferred his rights. My blood ran cold. This wasn't about James. It was about her. She'd orchestrated this every step, and James was either too weak to see it or complicit. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head, his warning about wolves, about guarding what mattered. I'd spent years proving I could run his company, facing down skeptics who thought a young woman couldn't handle it. And now this family, my family, was trying to strip it away. I slammed the folder shut, the sound cutting through the room. "I'm not signing this," I said, my voice shaking but clear. Diane's face tightened, her smile gone. "You're making a big mistake," she said, leaning forward. "This is about trust. Trust." The irony burned. Sheila scoffed, muttering ungrateful under her breath. I stood my chair, scraping the floor, and looked at James, giving him one last chance. "Are you with me or with her?" I asked, my voice breaking. He opened his mouth, but no words came. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. I grabbed my purse and walked out, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, tears burning my eyes. I'd married James thinking we'd build a life together, but now I saw it. I was alone, surrounded by people who saw me as a prize, not a person. The betrayal wasn't just Diane's, it was James's too, and that cut deeper than anything. I drove to a hotel, the city lights streaking past like tears I refused to let fall. My phone buzzed relentlessly, James, then my mom, then James again, but I silenced it, checking into a sterile room with thin walls. Alone, I sank onto the bed, my dress still crumpled from dinner, and let the weight of it all crash over me. James's silence at that table, his failure to stand up, wasn't just weakness. It was betrayal as sharp as any knife. And Diane's scheme, that hidden clause, was proof she'd been plotting to gut my grandfather's legacy from the start. I felt like a fool thinking love could be enough. My mom's voice broke the silence when I finally answered her call. "Clara, what happened?" she asked, her worry crackling through the line. I told her about the dinner, the document, James's complicity. Her sigh was heavy, familiar. "I trusted your father once," she said. "He took my savings, my dreams, and left us with nothing. Don't let them do that to you." Her story, one she rarely shared, twisted the knife deeper. She'd been me, young and hopeful, until someone she loved stripped her bare. Was this my fate too? I paced the room, my bare feet cold on the carpet, and thought back to my first year running the company. I was 22, fresh out of college, walking into boardrooms full of men twice my age who smirked at my inexperience. I'd fought for every decision, every contract, proving I wasn't just Harold's granddaughter, but a leader. Those battles had toughened me, but they hadn't prepared me for this, for a family turning my own marriage against me. I opened my laptop, desperate for control, and checked my company's legal filings. That's when I found an email from a shareholder forwarded by my assistant mentioning concerns about my leadership. The source, Diane. She'd been calling board members, spinning lies about my instability and poor decisions, claiming I wasn't fit to run the company. One shareholder, a loyal friend of my grandfather's, had flagged it, but others were rattled. My breath caught. This wasn't just about a document. Diane was waging war, trying to erode my credibility, to turn my own team against me. I pictured her smug at that dinner table, knowing she'd already set this in motion. And James, had he known his words, were a team echoed now, laced with poison. Was he part of her plan, or just a pawn too spineless to fight? I called Allison, my voice shaking as I told her about Diane's lies. She was at a bar, music thumping in the background, but her tone turned fierce. "Clara, I heard Sheila at the wedding bragging to someone about how Diane's fixing your finances. They're not stopping." Her words were a punch. Sheila too. The whole family was circling, waiting to carve up what I'd built. I hung up my chest so tight I could barely breathe and sank to the floor, my back against the bed. The room spun as memories flooded in my grandfather's laugh, his pride when I closed my first deal, his warning about trust. I'd thought I was careful, hiding my wealth, testing James's love. But I'd failed to see the bigger trap of family that saw me as a vault to crack. My marriage, barely a week old, felt like a lie. I curled my knees to my chest, tears finally spilling hot and unstoppable. Everything I'd built, everything I was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. Morning light crept through the hotel curtains, pale and unforgiving. I hadn't slept, my eyes raw from crying, my mind stuck on Diane's lies and James's betrayal. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, something shifted. I couldn't let them take my grandfather's company, not after everything he'd poured into it, not after I'd fought to prove I deserved it. I needed to act, not just for me, but for the legacy I'd sworn to protect. I grabbed my phone and called Margaret, my company's lawyer, her number one of the few I trusted. Margaret's office was in a brick building downtown, all polished wood and quiet confidence. She greeted me with a firm handshake, her gray eyes sharp behind glasses. I told her everything: Diane's document, the hidden clause, her calls to shareholders, James's complicity. Margaret listened, jotting notes, her pen scratching softly. When I finished, she leaned back, her voice steady. "Clara, we can protect your company, but it'll take decisive moves. Are you ready to draw a line?" I nodded, my throat tight. I was done being cornered. She outlined a plan: transfer the company's ownership to a trust, one I'd control exclusively, locking out any claims from Diane or James. It was ironclad, she said, but it came with a cost. "This could end your marriage," she warned, her tone gentle but blunt. "If James is tied to his mother's schemes, he'll see this as a betrayal." My chest ached at the thought. I loved James, or at least the man I thought he was, but love wasn't enough if it meant losing myself. "Do it," I said, my voice low but sure. Margaret nodded, pulling out forms, her efficiency a lifeline. As we worked, she dropped a bombshell. "Diane's done this before," she said, flipping through a file. 10 years ago, she sued her brother-in-law over a family business, claiming she deserved a share. She lost, but it shows a pattern. I stared at her, my pulse racing. Diane wasn't just greedy. She was relentless, a predator who'd honed her tactics. The thought made me sick, and it also steeled me. If she'd played this game before, I'd make sure she lost again. I signed the trust documents, each stroke of the pen feeling like a reclaiming of power. But the weight of it hit me as I left Margaret's office, the city buzzing around me. I was protecting my company, but I was also drawing a battle line with my husband. I drove to our apartment, my hands steady on the wheel, and found James in the living room, his eyes red, a half-packed bag on the couch. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, standing, his voice breaking. My heart twisted, but I held my ground. "I know about your mom's debts," I said, my words measured. "I know she's been after my company, and you didn't stop her." He flinched, stepping closer. "I didn't know she'd go this far," he said, his hands raised like a shield. "I thought she was just worried about us. Please, let's fix this." His plea was desperate, but it rang hollow. I thought of the dinner, his silence as Diane pushed that document, his "we're a team" that felt like a betrayal. "Fix it," I said, my voice rising. "You let her try to take everything I've built. How do I trust you now?" He reached for me, but I stepped back, my resolve hardening. "I'm protecting what's mine," I said, my eyes locked on his. "If you're really sorry, prove it. But I'm not waiting." His face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the man I'd fallen for, the one who'd sketched my portrait on a napkin. But that man was gone, or maybe he'd never existed. I turned and walked to the bedroom, my heart pounding with a mix of grief and fire. I was taking control, and no one, not Diane, not James, would stop me. The bedroom door clicked shut behind me, muffling James's voice as he called my name. I leaned against it, my breath uneven, but my mind was clear for the first time in weeks. I wasn't the girl who'd crumbled in that hotel room, drowning in tears and doubt. I was Clara, the woman who'd kept my grandfather's company alive through boardroom battles and sleepless nights. Diane wanted to break me, and James had let her try, but I wasn't giving them that power. Not anymore. I pulled out my laptop and emailed my assistant, scheduling an emergency shareholder meeting for the next morning. Diane's lies about my instability had rattled some board members, and I needed to face them head on. I spent the night drafting a speech that laid out my vision for the company rooted in my grandfather's values of hard work and integrity. My fingers trembled as I typed, not from fear, but from a fire I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about saving my company. It was about proving I was enough. The meeting was in our downtown office, a sleek conference room with windows overlooking the city. Shareholders filed in, some with wary glances, others with cautious nods. I stood at the head of the table of my navy blazer, a quiet armor, and began. My grandfather built this company on trust, I said, my voice steady. I've honored that trust every day, and I'm here to set the record straight. I detailed our growth, our contracts, my plans for expansion, each word a brick, rebuilding their confidence. When I addressed the rumors, I didn't name Diane, but I was blunt. Someone's been spreading lies about my leadership. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this company. Murmurs rippled through the room, but then Nathan James's cousin stood up. I froze, my pulse spiking. He'd been at Diane's dinner, silent, watching. Was he here to sabotage me, Clara? He said, his voice low. I need to say something. He pulled out his phone and played a recording, Diane's voice crackling through the speaker. If Clara won't sign, we'll sell the company to Pinnacle Logistics. They're offering millions. Gasps filled the room. Pinnacle was our biggest competitor, circling for years. Diane wasn't just after control. She wanted to dismantle everything I'd built. The shareholders' faces hardened, and I saw my opening. That's why I've moved the company into a trust, I said, holding their gaze. It's safe, and I'm still leading it. Are you with me? The room erupted in nods, a few clapping, their trust restored. Nathan caught my eye, giving a small nod, and I realized he'd chosen a side mine. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. After the meeting, I hired a private investigator recommended by Margaret to dig into Diane's schemes. If she was talking to Pinnacle, there'd be a paper trail, and I wanted it. The cost stung, but it was an investment in my peace. By afternoon, I was drained, my adrenaline fading, but I had one more stop. I drove to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried, the air thick with the scent of mowed grass and earth. His headstone was simple, etched with his name and dates, but it felt like a monument to everything he'd taught me. I knelt, tracing the letters with my finger, and whispered, I'm fighting Grandpa. I won't let you down. The wind stirred soft against my face, and I felt him there, not as a ghost, but as a strength I'd carried all along. I stood, my shoulders squared, and drove back to the city, my resolve like steel. At a stoplight, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were tired, but fierce, the eyes of a woman who'd chosen herself. I didn't know what came next with James, with Diane, but I knew I was ready. I turned up the radio, let the music fill the car, and drove on, my heart steady, my hands firm on the wheel. 2 days after the shareholder meeting, I walked into my company's office, the hum of printers and soft chatter grounding me. The board had voted unanimously to keep me as CEO, their trust a lifeline after weeks of doubt. But the victory felt hollow as I sat at my desk, staring at a photo of James and me from our engagement, his arm around me, both of us laughing. He'd moved out the night I confronted him, leaving a note, I need time. I'm sorry. I'd crumpled it, but the words lingered sharp as glass. I needed to face Diane to end this once and for all. I called her, my voice calm, and asked to meet at her office. A small real estate firm she ran from a strip mall. She agreed, her tone clipped but curious. When I arrived, the waiting room smelled of stale coffee, its beige walls lined with faded property listings. Diane sat behind a cluttered desk, her posture rigid like she'd been expecting a fight. I slid a USB drive across to her, the private investigator's findings burned onto it. This is everything, I said, my eyes steady. Your calls to Pinnacle Logistics, your emails about selling my company. It's over. Her face didn't change at first, her lips pursed as she picked up the drive, turning it in her manicured fingers. Then she laughed, a short, brittle sound. You're smarter than I thought, Clara, she said, leaning back. But you're naive if you think this changes anything. Families share and you're holding out. I stared, my pulse steady but my stomach churning. She wasn't denying it. No apologies, no shame, just defiance, as if I was the one in the wrong. I'd expected anger, maybe tears, but this cold dismissal cut deeper, like she believed she was entitled to my life's work. Before I could respond, she leaned forward, her voice dropping. "I could make this go away," she said, sliding an envelope toward me. 50,000. Drop this and we're done. A bribe. My breath caught, not from temptation, but from the audacity. She thought she could buy me, cheapen my grandfather's legacy with a check. I pushed the envelope back, my hands steady. "You don't get it," I said, my voice low. "This isn't about money. It's about what's mine." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw something flicker, panic maybe, or desperation. I stood to leave, but the door opened and James walked in, his face pale, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. My heart stuttered. He looked between us, his eyes landing on the USB drive, then on me. "Clara, what's going on?" he asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't slept. Diane spoke before I could, her tone sharp. "Your wife's trying to tear this family apart, James. Tell her to stop." I waited, my breath shallow, hoping he'd finally see her for what she was. But he just stood there, his shoulders slumped, and said, "Clara, maybe we can talk this out. For us. For us." Those words, once so warm, now felt like chains. I looked at him, the man I'd loved, and saw someone caught torn between his mother's grip and the life we'd promised each other. But his hesitation was an answer, and it broke something in me, not with a crash, but with a quiet snap. I turned to Diane, my voice flat. "You'll hear from my lawyer." I walked out past James, past the weight of his silence, the air outside cold and biting. Back at the office, I got word that Sheila had started a whisper campaign telling mutual friends I was unstable, trying to save Diane's reputation. It stung, but it didn't surprise me. What did was the call from Allison, her voice urgent. "Clara, people are rallying behind you. Sheila's lies are backfiring." I hung up, staring at my desk, the photo of James still there, his smile a stranger's now. The fight wasn't over, but I'd won this round. Yet as I sat there alone, the silence was heavy, my victory tasting like ash. I drove back to the apartment, the city's pulse fading into a dull hum. The victory over Diane should have felt sweet, but it sat heavy like a stone in my chest. Inside the place was a too quiet James's absence carved into the empty couch, the single coffee mug in the sink. I poured a glass of water, the taps gurgle loud in the stillness, and sat at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing its worn edges. My phone buzzed, Allison checking in, but I let it go to voicemail. I needed to feel this to understand what I'd just done. The next morning, I threw myself into work, hiring a new COO, a sharp woman named Rachel who'd come recommended by Margaret. Her no-nonsense handshake and quick grasp of our logistics felt like a fresh start. "Let's keep this company moving forward," she said, and I nodded, grateful for someone who saw the mission, not the drama. But even as we mapped out strategies, my mind drifted to James. He hadn't called since Diane's office, and I hadn't reached out. The space between us was growing, and I wasn't sure I wanted to close it. My mom came over that evening, her presence a quiet anchor. She brought takeout greasy cartons of lo mein, and we ate in silence, at first the clink of forks oddly comforting. "You did what I couldn't," she said finally, her eyes soft but steady. "When your father took everything, I froze. You didn't." Her words were a gift, but they stung too, reminding me of her own losses, how she'd rebuilt alone. I wanted to ask if she'd ever forgiven him, but the question stuck in my throat. Instead, I squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back her calluses rough against my skin. Later, as I washed dishes, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped, half expecting Diane, but it was James, his coat damp from a sudden rain. He looked smaller, his eyes shadowed a grocery bag dangling from one hand. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, letting him in, the air between us thick. He set the bag down, my favorite tea a peace offering, and started, "I didn't know the whole plan, Clara. Mom kept me in the dark, but I should have stopped her. I'm sorry." His voice cracked, and I saw the boy I'd loved, the one who'd left notes on my fridge. But I also saw the man who'd stood silent too many times. I wanted to believe him, but trust was a thread worn thin. "You knew she was in debt," I said, my voice even cold. "You let her push me, James. Why?" He looked down, his hands twisting. I thought we'd figure it out together." I was wrong. His honesty was raw, but it wasn't enough. I thought of my mom's story, her warning about men who take, and I felt a wall rise inside me. "I need more than sorry," I said, my words measured. "I need you to choose me, not her." He nodded, his eyes wet, and said he'd started therapy, wanted to rebuild. "I'm staying at Nathan's," he added. "I'll give you space." It was a start, but it felt fragile, like a promise written in sand. We agreed to try couples counseling, a tentative step, but as he left, the apartment felt colder, his tea untouched on the counter. I locked the door, my reflection in the window pale and resolute. I'd protected my company, drawn a line, but the cost was this: a marriage on the edge, a heart bruised but unbowed. I sank into a chair, the silence wrapping around me, heavy with all I'd gained and all I'd lost. I needed to get away, to find a place where the noise of the past weeks couldn't follow. So I packed a small bag and drove 3 hours to my grandfather's old cabin tucked in a quiet corner of the Appalachian foothills. The road wound through hills dappled with early fall color reds and golds catching the light. When I pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered, its cedar siding weathered, the porch sagging under years of rain. But it smelled the same pine and earth, a scent that pulled me back to summers spent here as a kid chasing fireflies while my grandfather grilled burgers. Inside, the air was cool, the furniture draped in dust sheets. I dropped my bag and opened the windows, letting the breeze carry in the rustle of leaves. This was his sanctuary, where he'd come to think, to plan, to heal. I walked to the bookshelf, its shelves bowed under old novels and fishing magazines, and pulled out his journal again. I hadn't touched it since before the wedding, but now, with everything behind me, I needed his words, his steadiness. I settled into a creaky armchair, the leather cool against my skin, and flipped to a new page. He'd written about forgiveness, not the kind preached in church, but the kind you carve out for yourself. "Letting go isn't weakness," he wrote. "It's choosing to carry what makes you stronger." I traced the ink, his handwriting jagged but sure, and thought about James, about Diane, about the hurt they'd caused. Forgiveness felt distant, like a town I couldn't yet reach, but reading his words softened something in me. I wasn't ready to absolve them, but maybe I could stop letting their actions define me. I stepped outside, the grass damp under my boots, and walked to the creek that ran behind the cabin. The water was clear, gurgling over smooth stones, and I sat on a flat rock, the cold seeping through my jeans. As a girl, I'd spent hours here, skipping rocks, listening to my grandfather's stories about his early days when he'd driven trucks himself, sleeping in the cab to save money. He'd made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, but he'd never let it harden him. I wanted that resilience, that ability to bend without breaking. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me back. It was Allison, her voice bright but careful. "Just checking on you," she said. I told her I was in the cabin, needing space. Then she dropped a surprise. "Diane's in trouble, Clara. Some fraud charges tied to her real estate deals. It's all over local news." I exhaled the news, landing like a stone in still water. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I felt tired. Diane's downfall wasn't my victory. It was just another ripple in a mess I'd already walked away from. "Thanks for telling me," I said, and hung up, the creek's murmur filling the silence. Back inside, I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, the crackle of kindling a small comfort. I pulled out a notebook and started writing a letter to James, not to send, but to untangle my thoughts. I wanted us to be enough. I wrote, my pen moving slow. "But I can't carry your choices." The words hurt, but they were true. I'd fought for my company, for myself, and now I needed to figure out what I wanted from him, if anything. The fire's glow danced on the walls, and I set the pen down, my breath steady, the weight of the fight finally easing just a little. The next morning, I woke to birdsong, the cabin's quiet wrapping around me like a quilt. I brewed coffee, the old percolator hissing on the stove, and took my mug to the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The air was crisp, carrying the faint sweetness of fallen leaves. I sat on the steps watching mist curl over the hills and felt a stillness I hadn't known in months. The fight with Diane, the fracture with James, they were still there, but they didn't own me anymore. I was learning to carry them differently, lighter somehow. I drove into town, a sleepy place with a single diner and a hardware store. My mom was waiting at a picnic table outside, her scarf bright against the gray sky. She'd insisted on coming, saying she needed to see me, and I didn't argue. Over pancakes, sticky with syrup, she told me about her own healing, how she'd let go of my father's betrayal, not for him, but for herself. "It's not about forgiving," she said, her fork paused midair. "It's about not letting the hurt decide who you are." Her words settled in me, simple but heavy, like stones smoothed by a river. Back at the cabin, I found an old cigar box on a shelf, its lid carved with my grandfather's initials. Inside were trinkets, a pocket knife, a faded postcard, a photo of us by the creek, my gap-toothed grin wide next to his. I held the photo, my thumb brushing its edges, and remembered his laugh, rough like gravel, but warm. He'd forgiven a business partner once, not out of weakness, but because he believed in second chances. I wasn't there yet with James, but the idea didn't feel impossible anymore. It was a crack in the door letting in light. My phone rang as I packed to leave. It was our therapist confirming a session with James the next day. I'd agreed to try counseling not because I was sure we'd make it, but because I owed myself the chance to know. "He's been showing up," she said, her voice kind. I nodded, though she couldn't see, and hung up my chest tight, but not heavy. I locked the cabin, the key cold in my hand, and drove home, the hills fading in my rear view. That evening, I spoke at a local business conference, a last-minute invite I'd almost declined. The room was small, filled with entrepreneurs, their faces eager but worn. I shared my grandfather's story, not the betrayal, but the grit, how he'd built something from nothing and trusted me to carry it on. Their applause was soft, genuine, and for the first time I felt like I wasn't just his granddaughter, but a leader in my own right. Afterward, James texted asking how it went. I didn't reply, not yet, but I didn't delete it either. At home, I cooked dinner with James, our first in weeks. He chopped onions, his hands clumsy but earnest, and we laughed when the smoke alarm chirped. It wasn't fixed, not even close, but it was a moment fragile and real. Later, I slipped on my wedding ring, its weight familiar again, and stood by the window, the city's glow soft below. I didn't have all the answers, but I had a quiet certainty that I could face whatever came. My breath fogged the glass, and I smiled, just for myself, ready to keep going. A year later, I stood in the ballroom of a downtown hotel, the annual gala for my company buzzing around me. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in white linen, and the air hummed with laughter and clinking glasses. I wore a simple black dress, my hair loose, feeling more like myself than I had in ages. The company was thriving, our new contracts pushing us into markets my grandfather had only dreamed of. I'd spent months rebuilding not just the business, but me, piece by steady piece. I mingled, shaking hands with clients, their smiles genuine, their trust earned through late nights and hard calls. Rachel, our COO, caught my eye across the room, raising her glass in a quiet toast. I nodded back, grateful for her partnership, for the way she'd stepped in when I needed to focus on healing. The gala wasn't just a celebration of profits. It was proof we'd weathered the storm, that I'd kept my grandfather's vision alive while carving out my own. James was there too, standing by a window, his tie slightly crooked. We were living together again, our marriage stitched back with careful threads. Counseling had been brutal, peeling back layers of hurt, but it taught us to talk, to listen, to set boundaries. He'd cut contact with Diane, a choice that cost him, but proved he meant his apologies. We weren't perfect, some days were still heavy, but we were honest, and that was enough for now. He caught me looking, his smile soft, and I felt a warmth, not the wildfire of our early days, but a steady ember built to last. I stepped outside for air, the night cool against my skin, the city's skyline sharp and bright. My mom joined me, her coat pulled tight, her presence a quiet strength. "You've done good, Clara," she said, her voice low proud. She'd come to the gala her first time seeing this part of my world, and I saw her eyes widen at the scale of it, at what I'd held on to. We stood in silence, the kind that didn't need filling, and I thought of her own battles, how she'd raised me alone, never letting bitterness win. Her resilience was my foundation, and I was grateful every day for it. Back inside, I gave a short speech, my voice steady as I thanked the team, the clients, the shareholders who'd stood by me. I didn't mention the betrayal, but I spoke of trust, of building something that lasts. The applause was warm, and I felt it settle in me, not as pride, but as peace. I'd started a scholarship in my grandfather's name, funding women entrepreneurs, and tonight we'd announced our first recipients. Their faces bright with hope reminded me why I'd fought, not just for me, but for what could grow from it. As the night wound down, I slipped into a quiet corner, a glass of wine in hand, and watched the room. My life wasn't what I'd imagined when I said my vows, but it was mine, shaped by choices I'd made, by scars I'd learned to carry. I exhaled the tension of the past year, loosening, and felt ready to step into whatever came next, not fearless, but unafraid. As the gala's music softened, I wandered to a table where the scholarship recipients sat, their chatter bright and nervous. One, a young woman named Mia, caught my eye. She was maybe 20, her dress borrowed, her hands fidgeting as she told me about her startup idea, a delivery service for rural communities. Her passion, raw and unpolished, reminded me of my grandfather's early days when he'd sketched routes on napkins, dreaming big. I listened, nodding, and offered a few tips, but mostly I just saw the spark I'd almost lost. Helping her, helping all of them, wasn't just about money. It was about passing on what my grandfather gave me, belief in what's possible. Later, I found a letter in my purse, slipped there by an assistant. It was from Diane, her handwriting neat but stiff. "Clara, I was wrong. I'm sorry. No excuses, no pleas, just those words." I read it twice, then folded it away. I didn't feel anger, not anymore, but I didn't need to respond either. Her actions had cost her James her reputation and whatever power she'd chased. I'd chosen peace over revenge, and that was enough. My mom's words from the cabin echoed, "It's not about forgiving, but about not letting the hurt decide you." I was learning that day by day. At home, I started new habits, small anchors in a life I was rebuilding. Mornings, I'd walk to a nearby park, sit on a bench and watch the world wake up, joggers, dog walkers, kids chasing pigeons. I'd bring a thermos of tea and let my thoughts wander, not to the past, but to now, the company's next steps, a trip I wanted to take, the way James and I were learning to laugh again. These moments, quiet and mine, were where I found myself again, not as the woman who'd fought Diane, but as Clara, whole and enough. James and I set new rules. No secrets, no assumptions. He'd started his own design business, small but growing, and I loved seeing him light up when he talked about it. We'd cook together some nights, bumping elbows in our tiny kitchen, or sit on the couch sharing stories we'd skipped in our rush to love. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that honesty felt like solid ground after months of quicksand. I'd look at him, sometimes his profile soft in the lamplight, and feel grateful not for what we'd been, but for what we were becoming. The biggest lesson I've carried from this isn't about wealth or betrayal, though those shaped me. It's about self-worth, about knowing you're enough even when others try to take what's yours. Trust is precious, but it's not a gift you give blindly. It's earned, and it starts with trusting yourself. I hid my company to protect it, but in the end, I protected me, my heart, my strength, my right to choose my path. That's what I want to hold on to, what I hope Mia and those women see in their own journeys. Pain can break you, but it can also build you if you let it. What's a moment in your life where you had to fight for yourself, where you found your own strength? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. It's those shared experiences that connect us, that remind us we're not alone. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe to join me for more. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, someone finding their way through their own storm. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for carrying your own light. Here's to healing, to growing, and to all the quiet victories ahead.